Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are going to be beginning a new book. But, as of course is usual with soft stories, it is not truly a new book. This book that we will be reading together over the next few weeks was originally published in 1960, and that is the date from which this copy originates. We will be reading Don John's Ducats by Roger Pilkington. This book came into my possession through my aunt, an absolutely lovely woman who, it turns out, had owned this book for many years before I ever got my hands on it. On the interior of the front cover, there is an inscription dedicated to her from Christmas 1968. And so, just like Mary Poppins, it's very heartening to me that not only was I able to enjoy this book as a child, but that another dear member of my family was able to do so as well. And so I hope you all, too, can enjoy Don John's Ducats along with me. It's a fun book, and I think the thing that I remember best about it is just how evocative the language seemed at the time. The restaurant that they ate at always seemed so full of life, and I can picture it in my mind still. The adventures that these four go on have stuck with me for many years, and I hope it will have the same transportive effect on me again, and on you all as well. So without further ado, let's begin Don John's Ducats. We're beginning, of course, with Chapter 1, which is entitled The Tale of Don John. Now, on this first page there is a beautiful map, which, of course, has no relevance to us yet, but as we learn more about the story and where everything happens, we can see along the course of the canal. You can tell it's a canal because of all of the locks along its length. The parts of the story seem to be here inscribed. Now, of course, this does all take place in Belgium, and unfortunately, and much, I'm sure, to the chagrin of my wonderful aunt, my French is abysmal. So you will have to excuse me any missteps in my pronunciations. I hope the story will be no less enjoyable for it. Chapter 1. The Tale of Don John. A long blast sounded from somewhere upstream and echoed from the steep rocks of the cliff across the river before it died away. Michael stirred sleepily in his upper bunk in the Dabchick's forward cabin, but when the sound was repeated, he opened his eyes and stared up at the deckhead. A third time the strong note boomed down the river, and this time Michael sat up. He drew back the little curtain from in front of the porthole beside his bunk and rubbed the moisture off the glass with his fingers. Then he peeped out. Overhead, the sky was clear and blue, but the broad river was hidden from side to side by a film of downy mist which lay a couple of feet thick across its surface. Around the piers of the bridge of Hoy-sur-Maze, the vapour heaved and swirled a little where the current through the arches caught it from below and twisted it. Across the stream, the dark mass of the church of Notre Dame stood cornerwise to the bank, its solid square towers dwarfing the orange-tiled houses of the quayside street, and even the highest of the pointed gables reached no farther than halfway up the side of the grey stone building. Yet even Notre Dame itself seemed small compared with the sheer face of yellow limestone which rose immediately behind it, dotted with beeches and crowned by the huge and blank-walled fortress of Hoy. Bare and forbidding, the keep seemed to stare out across the valley, its loopholes commanding the sharp bend of the river and looking down threateningly, not only upon the bridge, but also, as it seemed to Michael, upon the Dabchick, where she lay moored just downstream of the arches. Once again, the loud, imperious hoot broke the stillness of the early morning, and pressing his face against the glass to look up beyond the bridge, Michael could see the heavy black bows of a barge cutting through the mist towards the central arch. "Roger Eugene," he said to himself as he read the lettering beside the stern. "She's a big one, too. I'm not surprised her skipper blows off like that before running down on the bridge hole." Michael watched the barge slowly rounding the bend to pass close beside the Dabchick, and as the broad stern drew level and the heavy throb of the motor shook the Dabchick's cabin, he swung his legs over the side of the bunk and slipped quietly to the floor. On the lower bunk, Peter was still soundly sleeping with his mouth open, but as the Dabchick surged on the wash of the Roger Eugene, the thump of her fenders against the stone quayside woke him. He opened his eyes and saw Michael pulling off his pyjamas. "What's going on?" he asked without moving. "Only a barge," said Michael from inside the pyjama top, "but it's 7 o'clock already, and a lovely day. We ought to be underway." "There's no hurry," said Peter with a yawn. "No, but it's a pity to miss everything by lying in our bunks. Holiday time is no time to stay in bed late. I don't call 7 o'clock very late. There's no tide to catch or anything of that sort. 7 o'clock is quite late enough, said Michael as he pulled on his shirt. Come on, Skipper. Just look at the sunshine out there already. Peter grunted and sat up. Are the girls awake? He asked. I don't expect so, Michael said. As soon as I'm dressed, I'll give them a knock, and then I'll lay the breakfast while they're getting ready. But I'll have a quick wash first. It's always a mistake to let them get to the basin before us. They take such an age. Carol's quite as bad as Jill. I could have a bath in the time it takes them to wash their faces. It's a good thing we haven't a bath aboard, or they'd be in it for hours. Perhaps they like being really clean, said Peter. I wouldn't discourage them if I were you. Michael pulled on his shorts, grabbed his towel, and scrambled up the companion ladder to run quickly round the catwalk to the stern, tiptoeing as he passed along the side of the cabin, so as not to wake his sister Jill and her friend. He was nearly at the stern when he thought he heard his name being called. He stopped, and once again he heard it faintly from somewhere up in the air. Michael! Michael! Ahoy! Looking up, he began to scan the cliff on the opposite shore, and as soon as he could just make out 2 figures on the parapet of the fortress, right at the very top. One of them was waving a scarf, and picking up his towel, Michael waved it to and fro, to show that he had seen them. Then he stepped down the stern ladder to the washroom, slightly annoyed that the girls had got up so early without waking him. From the top of the fortress, the 2 girls saw him disappear. And here we have a beautiful illustration of the Church of Notre Dame and the fortress, atop which we can just see 2 figures signalling to Michael down below here. It's wonderful how boys can sleep, said Jill as she wound her scarf round her neck again. If they didn't feel hungry, I don't expect they'd ever wake up at all. Carol laughed. Oh, they're not so bad. My brother in New Zealand is far worse than Peter for wanting to lie in bed. And if you wake him up, he's always in a temper. I don't think your brothers are as fond of their beds as some boys. Michael's usually up and about before we are. Not if there isn't something to wake him, Jill said. If it hadn't been for that barge hooting away on the bend, I expect he'd still be asleep. Carol leaned over the parapet and looked down to the river below. I wish I'd brought my camera, she said. The Dabchick looks lovely from up here. She is lovely, Jill said, but she looks rather small when you see her moored close to those barges. I think being on the boat is wonderful, Carol said. I've loved coming aboard every time you've asked me. You're a very good sort of person to have, said Jill. It's no good having people on a boat if they feel miserable when it rains, or get upset if dinner isn't at 1 o'clock every day. Doing things differently is half the fun, said Carol. I think it would be a pity if everything was as regular as it is at home. I like the way we're all on our own on the Dabchick. You know, we go wherever we want, and we do what we like. and there are no hotel porters or head waiters to look down their noses if anyone laughs. I went away with my parents the last time they came over from New Zealand, and we stayed at a rather smart hotel in Sussex. Honestly, it was awful. If you spoke above a whisper, all the old people in the armchairs sat up and peered at you over their newspapers. Jill laughed. Do you know, I've hardly ever stayed in a hotel. You see, having the boat, we've always been either aboard the Dabchick or at home. It's fun at home, but I like being on the Dabchick best of all. So do I, said Carol. And it was lovely of you to invite me to come again. We still have nearly a fortnight, Jill said. It was a brilliant idea of Daddy's to arrange things with the yacht club at Liège before he and Mummy went home. It certainly was a good idea. It had taken the Dabchick 2 weeks to reach Liège from Henley-on-Thames, and if the weather in the Channel had not been so perfect, she might have been held up for several days in Ramsgate or Dover before there was a chance to cross. There would have been no time to run much further up the Meuse than Liège itself before turning back for home, had not Jill's father hit upon his idea. At Liège there was a handy little yacht port in a disused lock, and he had suddenly decided to leave the Dabchick there all through the winter, instead of taking her home to the Thames. This would give the crew another fortnight on the Meuse, and in the following year they could start exploring farther afield without having to spend another couple of weeks on the first part of the journey, covering a route they already knew. Having arranged all the details with the harbour-master and secretary of the club, Chief Inspector Branksome and his wife had continued aboard the Dabchick as far as Huy, and late on the previous night they had set off for Liège by bus on their journey home to England. Peter was left in charge as usual, with Jill responsible for the domestic affairs and housekeeping on board, and Michael and Jill's friend Carol to make up the rest of the crew. It was by no means the first time these four had been alone on the boat, and they were perfectly well able to manage for themselves. Peter was 16, and he could look after the engine and deal with anything but a major breakdown, which so far had never happened. Michael was only 12, but for years he had been the chief steersman of the party. It was always he who took the boat in and out of locks, because through long practice he could handle her to an inch. Jill, who came about halfway in age between her two brothers, was so handy as boatswain that an outsider might almost have thought that she had lived on a boat all her life. Carol, who had been her particular friend ever since her first term at a day school in London, was by now quite used to all the odd jobs of holding ropes and mooring and fending off with a tire if a heavy barge squeezed close alongside in a lock, and she rarely had to be told what to do. So, when the time had come to say goodbye in the market square behind the riverside church of Notre-Dame de Huy, the chief inspector knew that he could return to his duties at Scotland Yard without worrying that the Dabchick might come to harm. Besides, the Meuse was quite a different matter from the open sea, where a breakdown of the engine might be a serious matter. The two girls took a last long look at the lovely view upstream, where the river wound beyond, an island behind the hills on the right bank. Then they made their way down through the keep to the heavy iron gate, and out to the long zigzag path which led down to the riverside. "What's the programme?" Carol asked as they jog-trotted round a bend under the trees. "Are we going to stay at Huy for today?" "I don't think so," Jill said. The guidebook on board says the fort is the most interesting thing. Otherwise, there's just an old fountain, and the church, and some houses which go back to the days of the infamous Don John." "Who on earth was he?" Carol asked. "Don't ask me. The book didn't say. Not even why he was infamous. Perhaps it meant unfamous, not infamous." Jill laughed. "Anyway, I think we'll move farther up the river as soon as we've had breakfast. I expect Peter and Michael will want to be underway again." "What's the next port of call?" Carol asked. "I've no idea. We can stop wherever we want to." "I hope we can have a swim." "Why not? We might get Michael to tow us, too," Jill said. "Fine," Carol said. "Come on, let's run and get breakfast ready right away." By the time they had reached the foot of the cliff and crossed the bridge to where the Dabchick was moored against the stone wall which fronted the cobbled quayside, Michael was already away with the milk can to hunt out a milkman on his early rounds. He had hurriedly set out the breakfast things on the table in the saloon, too, and as a hint to the girls, he had put out egg cups. Michael was always keen to try any strange food which they might find in the places through which they passed, but he was sure that other countries made a great mistake in having a breakfast which only consisted of bread and butter or jam. He always pointed out that if one had rather more to eat at breakfast, there would then be less to cook for lunch, so that it was really better if the crew of the Dabchick kept to their English habit of what he called a proper breakfast. By now Peter was up too, and he was just finishing tidying the forward cabin when Jill and Carol came hurrying down the ladder to tell him about the fort and the wonderful view to be had from the top. "You ought to run up there," Jill said. "I might have a look at the fort when we come through again on our way back to Liège," Peter said. "But breakfast is first on the list for today, and after that I think we might move on." "Here's Michael," said Carol, looking out through the hatch. "He's got the milk, so I'll go and put on the kettle." Michael dropped to the catwalk and stepped carefully down the ladder with the milk can. "Here," he said, handing it to Jill. "It's straight from the cow, I should think. It's hot enough, anyway. And look, I've something else. You can all shut your eyes and smell." He pulled a packet out of his shirt and held it under Jill's nose. Then Peter's. "Whew!" exclaimed Peter. "It smells like, a whole herd of goats." "Or something gone rotten," said Jill. "You can look now," Michael said, unwrapping the paper. "It's fromage de Hoy. The milkman said it was a great specialty, and it ought to be eaten while it's fresh." "That's fine," Jill said. "We'll have it for breakfast." "If it smells as strong as that when it's fresh, I'm glad I haven't met it when it's not in its first youth," said Peter. "Your fromage certainly has beaucoup de whiff about it." "It looks super, though," said Michael. "But nobody need have any if they don't want to. I wouldn't mind eating it all by myself." "We'll eat it," said Peter. "It's just that I was thinking we might need to air out the boat a bit afterwards." Michael's cheese proved a great success, and it certainly helped to vary the menu. The meal was quickly over, and the china washed up and put away in the lockers, and the bells of the town hall across the river had hardly finished tinkling their 8 o'clock folk-song melody when the Dabchick was moving out of Hoy. Here and there along the river, a barge lay below a chute, loading a cargo of cement or agricultural chalk, and the men looked up from their work to wave to the Dabchick in the friendly way in which people always greeted her as just another boat on the same waterway. Some of the ships were Belgian, others Dutch or French, but like the Dabchick, they also carried the red flag with a white square, which was compulsory on the Meuse. Although, as far as the crew of the Dabchick could make out, it had no particular meaning. 4 locks and 4 hours running brought the Dabchick to the outskirts of Namur, and a final lock on the edge of the city led through towards a fine modern road bridge just below where the river Sambre swept round a bend to make its confluence with the Meuse, at the foot of a fortress even more massive than that of Huy, and poised still higher above the river. "I'll take her in by that lawn just below the junction," Michael called. The girls took up their stations fore and aft, and Michael sidled the boat across the stream, waiting only to allow a clear run for a coal barge running out from the narrower channel of the Sambre. He slowed the engine, drifted in to within a few inches of the quayside, and held the boat in the current while Jill and Carol jumped up to drop their nooses over the stone bollards. Quickly, the Dabchick was made fast, and the engine was stopped. "Namur," said Peter, "or Namen, if you prefer it in Flemish." "I don't," Michael said. "What I would prefer is to run up and see the castle. Let's get ready and go." It was hot work, climbing the long flights of steps and the endless zigzags of the path which led up from beyond the Sambre to the outer ramparts of the fortress, and when they reached the very top and stood behind the low parapet, the crew were rather out of breath from their long climb. Straight below them was a bridge of several small and rounded arches, and a bus was crossing it from the opposite bank. From such a height, it looked no bigger than a toy. "This must have been a wonderful fortress," Jill said after a while. "I expect it's seen quite a few sieges in its day." "Yes, it has." The voice came from behind them, and they all turned round. A tall, thin, elderly man with grey hair and a small beard was standing, smiling at them. "Excuse me," he said, nodding to the girls. "It was none of my business to intrude myself into your conversation, but I have always been interested in the history of my city, and if people are talking about it, I just join in, out of habit. I am sorry." "Oh, please don't be sorry," Jill said. "We don't know anything about Namur. We've only just arrived here." The man smiled again. "You are with a tour, perhaps?" Then, seeing the frown on Michael's face, he added quickly, "But no, you are by yourselves." "We've come by boat," Carol said. "Look, if you come to the edge, you can just see her. There, down by the trees." The visitor leaned over the parapet and shaded his eyes to peer down the river in the direction they pointed. "The white one?" "Yes," said Carol. "She's a lovely boat, isn't she?" "I'm sure she is," said the man, "and you will find that from Namur onwards the river is even more beautiful. It must be a fine way to have a holiday if you are on a boat." "It's super," said Michael. "And the Meuse is a lovely river," Jill said. "Somehow I thought it would be quite different. Meuse. The name sounds sort of muddy and dull." on earth can a name sound muddy? Michael said. Oh, it just does, said Jill. Or if not muddy, then somehow tragic. Michael giggled. Honestly, Jill, you are queer. But she is right, said the man who was standing beside them. It has always been a sad river. Battles and sieges, yes, from the earliest times up to the last war, the Meuse has been a sad river. Blood has flowed under that bridge, time and time again. I think the young lady is quite right. Meuse is a sad name. He stood up from leaning over the edge of the fortifications. Would you like to know about this city of Namur? Yes, please, Carol said. So would I, said Jill. Good. Then let us sit here on the wall. First, I must introduce myself properly, yes? I am Monsieur Blanchard, and I was a schoolmaster, but now I am retired. And my name is Jill Branksome, and this is my brother Peter, and Michael, he is my older brother. And Carol is a friend of mine from school. After the formal introductions had been completed, Monsieur Blanchard took out a big grey silk handkerchief and flicked the stones on the top of the parapet. Now, you ladies may sit here, and then I will sit in the middle, and the gentleman on the other side. Good. He took his seat next to Jill. Where shall we begin? Right at the beginning, if you like, Jill said. No. Monsieur Blanchard shook his head and laughed. In the beginning, there was no Namur, you see. There was not even a river Meuse. I think we shall not do this like a history book, but I can just tell you some of the stories about the town and the fort, which I think are interesting. He turned towards Peter. Did you ever read about Julius Caesar at school? Yes, said Peter with a sigh. We had to. Then you are now in the land of Gaul, and this part of Gaul was conquered by the Romans about 50 BC, and Namur had a fortified castle in the days of Julius Caesar. But I think we shall jump forward and not worry ourselves with the Romans and the Merovingians and the Carolingians, or even with the great counts of Namur. I will tell you the story of Anson Whittingham after the Battle of Waterloo. He was an Englishman, as you would guess from his name, and there is a very strange story about him. Tell us, please, Jill said. Monsieur Blanchard gazed down towards a long island just upstream of the bridge, and then began his tale. It really started much earlier than the Battle of Waterloo, he said, right back in the year 1577, when the beautiful Queen Margaret of Navarre was on her way from France to the town of Spa to drink the waters there for the good of her health. At least that was said to be the reason for her journey, but the Queen really had quite a different purpose, for she was coming to the Netherlands to add her own dark schemes to the troubles of a land in which the people were desperately struggling to free themselves from the cruel rule of their Spanish overlords. Yes, she was a clever woman, said Monsieur Blanchard, and she was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. It was this that drew Don John to ride out and meet her. Don John? Jill exclaimed. "The infamous Don John." "Yes," said Monsieur Blanchard. "I see you know all about him." "Well, not really," Jill said. She explained that she had only seen his name in the guidebook. "But I have no idea who he was," she added. "Don John, the infamous Don John of Austria, was the man who governed these provinces for Spain," said Monsieur Blanchard, looking out over the valley. "And when he heard that the beautiful queen was coming to his dominions, he rode out on his own fine horse and met her, just as her cavalcade was approaching Namur down the valley of the Sambre." He turned and pointed towards where the Sambre flowed round the hillside on the edge of town. "Never had the citizens of Namur seen such magnificence," he said. "It was already late in the evening when Margaret of Navarre entered the city, but the streets were gaily lit, and the shops and houses were in a blaze of lanterns, not because the people were glad to see her, but because Don John had ordered the place to be decorated. And at last, right down the main street, came the most splendid litter with gilded pillars and glass windows, had coats of arms and gay flags, and inside the litter lay Margaret, the most famous beauty of her day, reclining on cushions of rich crimson velvet. Beside it rode the handsome Don John, with his head of curly hair, which had already set a fashion for the nobility of Europe. And as he jogged down the street on his superb charger, he laughed and chatted all the way with the magnificent queen, who was honoring his provinces with her visit. Behind the royal litter there followed two others, only a little less magnificent, and in these rode the chief ladies in waiting. Then came 10 beautiful maids of honor on horseback, and 6 coaches full of personal ladies' maids, and beyond these still more attendants, and finally a troop of horse guards to bring up the rear. Through the gaily lanterned streets the procession wound its way to the apartments which Don John had prepared for the visitor. Never had even Margaret of Navarre herself been provided with such splendid lodgings, for the walls were hung with gorgeous tapestries, seized from the homes of wealthy patriotic burghers in Antwerp and Liège, and all the furniture was decked out in rich brocade and cloth of gold hastily brought in from Don John's own castles, or stripped from the manors of the local nobility. And as a final touch, the bedspread and curtains of the chamber prepared for the cruel queen were beautifully embroidered, in the most splendid colours, with scenes from the Battle of Lepanto, in which Don John himself had led the fleets of Spain and Venice to sweep the Turkish ships from the Mediterranean. "I expect you know all about that," said Monsieur Blanchard with a twinkle in his eye. "It was the last great battle between fleets of galleys." "I think I've heard of it," Peter said, rather doubtfully. "It doesn't come in our history at school," Jill said. Monsieur Blanchard laughed. But then the exploits of Don John were of no great interest to England, although he was dreaming of marrying Mary, Queen of the Scots, and taking for himself the English throne. But we in Belgium and Holland learned all about him, for he was one of the greatest and most terrible tyrants who ever held our lands in his grasp." "What happened to him?" Carol asked. "That I shall tell you. But not just yet. Where was I? At the bedspread, Michael said. Ah, yes. And Monsieur Blanchard went on to tell how on the following day there had been a concert by the Spanish military bands, and a great banquet, at which the handsome Don John, with his golden hair and fair blue eyes, had sat with Margaret of Navarre at a table apart, flattering and complimenting the woman who had in fact come to scheme against him. Then, as a final compliment, the next afternoon was given over to a magnificent festival upon the Meuse, and down below the castle hill the musicians took their places in gaily painted barges decorated with flags and bunting, and rowed behind the stately boat in which Margaret lay on her velvet cushions beneath a gilded canopy, while Don John of Austria gazed into her eyes. It was on that island that they arrived, he said, pointing upstream to where the river divided to flow round a long and narrow islet and unite again above the bridge. Beyond, 3 black barges were just creeping out of the loch. There was a banquet was spread beneath the elms, and a bower of ivy was fashioned for Margaret of Navarre. There they danced half through the night beneath the summer stars, each of them plotting in secret the destruction of our country, yet each appearing to have no thought but for the other. And there, according to the legends of the people of this city, Don John offered her a great bag of gold pieces, part of the wealth he had wrung from the merchants of Antwerp, as the price of not immediately burning their city to the ground. No doubt Queen Margaret would indeed have liked to accept the gold, he continued, but she was too clever to put herself in his debt. Courtiers were watching, and among them were some of those same nobles of the Netherlands, whose allegiance she was trying to steal for herself. And so, graciously and delicately, she declined the rich gift, requesting Don John to use the gold for the welfare of the people of his domains, people for whom she really cared as little as he did. I do not think that the nobles of our land were deceived, said Monsieur Blanchard, still gazing towards the island, but they knew her character too well. But Don John had to take back his gold, and when on the next day he rode beside her litter as she left the city, he still had it with him. Don John of Austria was in the habit of riding throughout the Netherlands, provinces which he ruled for his half-brother King Philip of Spain, and he did not care to leave his bag of gold behind him. So when he left Namur, he carried it in his saddle-bag, and wherever he went he took it with him. Perhaps as the years went by, he might have tired of keeping the money continually beside him, and in any case, as Monsieur Blanchard pointed out, if he had lost it, he would quickly have extorted more from his unfortunate subjects. But it was not long before the famous Victor of Lepanto was brought low. Revolution swept over his domains, and in its wake followed a terrible epidemic of plague. A year after his romantic meeting with Margaret of Navarre, Don John was lying sick in a mere ruined cottage not very far from that same island in the Meuse. Deserted by his attendants, and without even a single servant at his side, he died. "I don't expect anybody was very sorry," said Carol. What happened to his gold? Michael asked. I suppose somebody took it. Monsieur Blanchard shook his head. No, it seems that he buried it under his bed, in the earthen floor of the miserable shack where he died. Many years later, it was found, and it was placed for safekeeping in the castle here. And every time there came a war or siege, it was hidden again, and afterwards it would be brought out once more, still in the same stout leather bag. Right until the time of Napoleon, it was here in the castle, and then, too, it was hidden away by men of the guard, who were loyal Netherlanders, even if they were subjects of France. The news of the great defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo was brought to the town by an English soldier, Ensign Whittingham. Exhausted and dishevelled, he rode in through the gateway of the city and broke the great news to the crowds who were waiting in breathless anxiety. And that same night, a celebration was held in the streets. There was a banquet, too, and when Don Juan's treasure was quickly dug out from its hiding place in the walls of the house of a leading citizen, it was Ensign Whittingham who was awarded the privilege of bearing it on his steed to the feast at the city hall. And that was the last time Don Juan's treasure was ever seen, said Monsieur Blanchard. Before the time came for the speeches to be made, Ensign Whittingham excused himself, explaining that he was still so overwrought from the stress of the fighting that he could not stay to the end. As he rose to go, he lifted the bag of gold from in front of his place and set it before the mayor. It was not long afterwards that the mayor made his speech to celebrate the victory, and when he did so he referred to Don Juan's tyranny centuries before. "This gold," he said, "is a symbol of the price our land has paid to its oppressors. And just as we have remained true, so we have kept the spoils of that wretched tyrant, as a reminder that though people may take our wealth, they cannot break our spirit." Then he opened the bag to pour out the ducats on a heap upon the table, and it was not gold, but stones, just a bag of stones. "How dreadful!" Jill exclaimed. "And you think that the English soldier had taken it?" Monsieur Blanchard nodded. After leaving the banquet, Ensign Whittingham had ridden casually through the streets until he came to the gate down there by the bridge. At the gate he was challenged, but he did not stop. Instead, he put the spurs to his horse and galloped right through the sentries. One of them fired after him and wounded his horse, but Ensign Whittingham leapt from it as it fell, and he plunged down the bank into the river. There, in the darkness of the night, he vanished. "If he was drowned, I think it served him right," Peter said. "That is, if he really stole the gold." "He was not drowned," said Monsieur Blanchard. "He disappeared, but he was certainly not drowned. Somehow he reached England and returned to his home. There, according to the records, he died very soon afterwards of a fever. Only the gold was never found, and it is quite certain that he did not have it with him when he died." "Where did he live?" Michael asked. "I cannot remember," said Monsieur Blanchard. "In the museum here there is a picture of his tombstone in a village somewhere in England, but I forget the name. It is of no importance." He pulled out his silk handkerchief and wiped his forehead. "Forgive me for telling you this story, which is about a man of your own country. Still, there are bad men in every land, are there not?" "I suppose there are," said Jill slowly. All the same, I think it was rather mean stealing the gold. If he did, said Michael. Yes, if he did, said Monsieur Blanchard, nodding. And of course we could never prove it. But I don't think there is very much doubt in that part of the story. Do you? And there we come to the end of the first chapter of Don John's Ducats, the setup for the adventure which is to come. I think we can all anticipate the direction in which that adventure will head. But it was lovely to reminisce with this old book and that old gentleman about the history of his town and the history of the notorious, the infamous Don John. I look forward to next time when we will continue with Chapter 2. I'll see you then, and goodbye.